morning, lovelies. Today we are going to define every single fantasy subgenre that I was able to find in my Google search. Let me tell you, I have been writing and consuming this genre my entire life, and there are some subgenres on this list that I was just like, that's a thing? So without further ado, let's define some fantasy subgenres. Number 1, high fantasy. This takes place in a fantasy world that is completely separate from Earth. This is a very broad umbrella within the fantasy genre, so we're going to start with all of the fantasy subgenres within this umbrella. The most common one is medieval fantasy. Medieval fantasy is a high fantasy world based off of medieval Europe specifically. This is what most people think of when they hear about high fantasy or even just fantasy in general because it dominated the genre for decades. It is closely followed by fables and fairy tales. This is a very specific but very common subset of high fantasy that are short, sweet, and usually have some sort of moral assigned to them. It's usually designed for kids. Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Aesop, Rapunzel, you know the drill. On the other end of the spectrum is political fantasy. The plot revolves around political intrigue and several figures grappling for power. There's rarely right or wrong or even, total black and white, a lot of grayness. I mean, Game of Thrones made its name as grimdark, and it is, but it is also a perfect example of political fantasy. Quest or heroic fantasy. This is basically high fantasy, but we have a quest that a hero must complete. I guess you could call it more of a plot structure. This is one of the most classic subgenres of fantasy, usually also being medieval fantasy at the same time. This emerged out of sword and sorcery, which is seen as the pioneer of fantasy. Speaking of which, sword and sorcery. This is a type of high fantasy story that focuses on sword fights and magic. Screw the politics, we just want a good, clean sword fighting fun. That is it for the explicitly high fantasy subgenre, so let's switch gears and turn to low fantasy. Low fantasy is any fantasy story that takes place on Earth. This is also a very broad umbrella term, so let's take a closer look at the subgenres here. Urban fantasy is one of the most popular forms of low fantasy. This is obvious, in-your-face magic that may or may not be known to non-magic users. Usually takes place in some sort of city, hence the urban. Arcane punk. Now, this is basically urban fantasy, but we are explicitly combining magic with science. Sometimes the two get along, and sometimes it's more of a magic versus science than a friendly cooperation. Paranormal. This is low fantasy involving magical creatures that, for the most part, many people believed or even still believe exist. Vampires, werewolves, ghosts, zombies, fae, etc. Futuristic or science fantasy. Technically, science fantasy is called Sword and Planet, which is basically sword and sorcery, but in space. It's basically urban fantasy or arcane punk fantasy, but set in the future. Mythic fantasy. This is low fantasy that centers around ancient mythology, either retellings or continuations of them. Legend fantasy. This is low fantasy that centers around popular legendary figures, the most common culprits being King Arthur and Robin Hood. It's usually some kind of historical fantasy. Speaking of which, historical fantasy. This is low fantasy but set in the past. It often overlaps with alternative history where magic becomes mainstream at some point in our history and it changes things and it creates a parallel version of Earth. So this would be steampunk fantasy, gaslamp fantasy, flintlock fantasy, Weird West fantasy. Magical realism is low fantasy, but the magic and fantasy elements are very subtle. Holes is probably my favorite example of this because while the curse on the main character is very real, it could also just be brushed aside as sheer bad luck. Okay, so those are all of the high fantasy explicit and the low fantasy explicit. Now we're going to talk about all of the subgenres in between or the subgenres that can exist in either high or low fantasy. We're going to start with assassin fantasy. It's usually high fantasy, but it can exist in low fantasy too. It's a fantasy story that revolves around assassins. Anthropomorphic fantasy. This story centers around animals. They're the main character. Either they are just animals with human intelligence and characters like warriors, or they're somehow evolved to be animals, but they're also walking, talking, and handling technology like Zootopia. Wuxia fantasy. Fantasy that focuses on East Asian culture, history, and elements. Usually involves some sort of martial arts. Afrocentric fantasy. The definition is in the name. It either takes place on the African continent or the fantasy world is inspired by African or even African American culture. Christian fantasy. This is fantasy that explicitly evokes Christian symbolism and imagery to tell the story, even though Christian figures themselves, like Jesus or Moses, will not explicitly appear. Think Narnia. Speaking of which, portal fantasy, aka crossworlds fantasy. This literally brings high and low fantasy together. The characters usually start on Earth and end up portaling to some fantasy world. They may or may not come back. Isekai is in this umbrella. Military fantasy, just like how political fantasy focuses on politics, military fantasy focuses on military, but with magic. And finally, romantic fantasy and fantasy erotica. I am too asexual and too aromantic to deal with this. Those are all the major fantasy subgenres that I could find. If you want a further breakdown or more in-depth definitions of some of these, I have a whole playlist called What's the Difference that is dedicated to doing just that, so check that out. I will see you next time. Bye, lovelies.